Hey everyone, I'm Belle Reid and welcome back to another video. Today I'm taking a look at the Digitone II from Elektron. Digitone II is a 16-voice polyphonic digital synthesizer that combines FM synthesis and a number of other synthesis techniques with complex sequencing, layering, and control. The original Digitone was released back in 2018, and this new version has a ton of expanded sound generation and sound shaping tools. There are more sound engines, more voices, more tracks, just a lot more. That said, the Digitone II is actually the first of Elektron's instruments that I've personally ever tried. So I'm not really approaching it with any kind of expectation or experience having used the original Digitone. Those of you who've been following this channel for a while probably know that most of my music is focused on using modular synthesizers. So when I first got my hands on this instrument, it definitely presented a very different workflow that I wasn't used to. But it's been a fun challenge wrapping my head around something new, and it has led me towards some very different sounds, which is always a cool thing. So in this video, I'm going to share some of my initial discoveries as I've been getting to know the Digitone II, and some ways that I've been using it in my music lately. I'll share a brief overview of the instrument and then dive into a bunch of different patches and sounds. There are lots of amazing videos out there that showcase the Digitone's ability to create rhythmic and melodic sequences. So the angle that I'm going to be taking with this video is to explore the Digitone II as more of an experimental sound design tool and to see what can emerge from that. If you want to grab a Digitone II for yourself, there's an affiliate link in the description below this video that you can use. All right, so let's get started. If you're already familiar with the Digitone, this layout should look pretty familiar. The original Digitone had 8 voices, and this one has 16. This version also has 16 tracks that can be either synth or MIDI tracks, instead of just 4 synth tracks and 4 MIDI tracks on the original Digitone. But perhaps one of the biggest changes is the addition of more sound engines, or synth machines, on the Digitone II. So you can think of a machine kind of like a synthesis engine that has a more or less specific functionality. In the Digitone II, there are a number of different synth machines and filter machines, all with a large number of controllable parameters to allow you to tweak and customize the sound. Unlike the original Digitone, there are 4 synth machines in the Digitone II: FM Tone, FM Drum, Wavetone, and Swarmer. So let's take a quick listen to those. FM Tone is similar to the sound engine found on the original Digitone. It's a 4-operator FM synth in the style of classic 80s FM synths, similar to what you might hear from a Yamaha DX7, for example, but much easier and faster to program. You have control over the specific algorithm within this machine, which alters how the 4 operators are connected to one another, effectively determining which individual operators can frequency modulate each other and how feedback is implemented in the FM structure. This can have a big impact on the resulting timbre of the sound. So I'll first turn up the modulation amounts here. Now we can listen to some different algorithms. You can also set the frequency ratios for the operators, alter the waveforms of operators C, A, and B1, detune the operators from one another, and alter the amount of feedback or self-modulation. Each algorithm has two outputs, which you can see here on the display. And this mix control allows you to crossfade between these 2 points so that you can get another dimension of sound out of a single preset. The FM engine has two operator envelopes as well, one for operator group A and the second for operator group B, allowing you to dial in all kinds of really interesting timbral shapes and contours. So for example, we could make a pretty short envelope here for operator group A, and maybe something that swells in and swells out for operator group B. Make that a little faster here, maybe turn up a little more FM. And there are also a number of other envelope-related parameters to control the behavior of the frequency modulation and how the timbre of the sound shifts over time. There is a lot to explore here, and I definitely recommend moving slowly through all of these parameters and trying out different combinations of settings. And finally, within this synth machine, there are controls for operator ratio offsets, which allow you to dial in inharmonic ratios, which can be really good for making more complex spectra, resulting in some really interesting timbres. So before we move on to the other synth machines in the Digitone II, I want to pause for just a moment to say that it's okay if all of the different FM synthesis terminology, algorithms, operators, ratios, all of that doesn't fully make sense to you. It can be tricky to wrap your head around. And honestly, in my experience, you don't really need to understand precisely what is happening all of the time in order to make some really, really interesting sounds and music with the Digitone II. Of course, you can study more about FM synthesis and you can work with very precise ratios if you want to, but one of the really great things about the Digitone is that you can also just slowly turn knobs, adjust different parameters, listen deeply, and find sounds that you like in a more intuitive way. The FM drum machine is similar to the FM tone engine in that it's another FM synthesis synth engine. However, the FM drum has editable parameters that lend themselves a bit more immediately to creating drum and percussive type sounds, such as, for example, the ability to add a little pitch drop to the sound. And the ability to mix in some noise. And also to shape the color and quality of the transient of the sound. And of course, you can still manipulate the FM algorithm and the operator ratios. Unlike the FM tone engine, which prioritizes the use of harmonic ratios between the operators, the FM drum engine gives you absolutely continuous control over the tuning ratios between oscillators. So basically, this means that the oscillators have an extremely wide tuning range. And experimenting with unconventional ratios is really easy and can result in some really, really interesting and bizarre sounds. The Wavetone Machine is a 2-oscillator wavetable synth engine with a whole bunch of different sound manipulation tools: ring modulation, phase distortion, variable noise colors, and hard to sync. The Swarmer machine has one primary oscillator and 6 additional detuned oscillators to create a really dense, intense sound. You can think of it kind of like a super saw engine. However, something that's cool about the implementation in the Digitone II is that you can change the wave shapes of the main tone and the swarm tones separately from one another. And you can also vary the behavior of the swarm tone in a number of different ways. So once you choose your synth machine and modify it to your liking, the oscillators then pass into a state variable filter and then into a variable width bandpass filter. There are also a number of different filter machines that you can select from instead of using the state variable filter. So there is a 4-pole low-pass filter, Elektron's legacy low-pass high-pass filter, 2 different comb filter options, and an equalizer. From there, the sound moves into a VCA with some different options for envelope types and panning. Both of the filters and the VCA have dedicated envelopes for shaping articulations. Sound then goes into an effects section where you can add distortion effects like bit depth reduction, overdrive, and sample rate reduction. You can choose if you want the distortion effects to be pre or post filter. There are also send levels for a global delay, reverb, and chorus. There's a simple modulation matrix here that allows you to route different LFOs to many of the editable parameters that we've been looking at so far. And of course, there is a super powerful sequencer. So I've been triggering everything so far manually, but we can also record a sequence. And then you can edit parameters of the sound live for the entire synth engine or for individual steps in the sequence, which Elektron refers to as a parameter lock. So you could start with the same basic sound, for example, and using parameter locks, wind up with very different versions of your sound on each sequence step. The Elektron sequencer workflow is really deep. There are a lot of controls for step probability, sequence length, Euclidean sequencing, and you can even use different presets on every step of an individual track. There are obviously a lot of other features here that I haven't talked about. This is a super, super deep synth, but I'm sure there are other great videos out there that will walk through all of the technical aspects. So for the rest of this video, instead, I'm going to be focusing on sharing a bunch of music, patches, and creative explorations from my first few weeks with the Digitone II. In Digitone II, you have 16 tracks available per pattern within a project, and you can use different synth engines and design completely different sounds for each of the tracks. Once you've set up a synth voice, you can use the trig keys to audition the sounds that you've programmed. This can be really helpful for when you're programming a sequence, for example, so that you can remember what sounds are assigned to specific tracks. But I've also found this to be really, really fun and interesting as a performative tool. So in this patch, I've programmed 16 different timbres into these 16 tracks, and I can play the Digitone like a multi-channel keyboard where each of these keys corresponds to a unique sound. This is a really interesting experience because most polyphonic synthesizers that have a keyboard built in would only allow you to play a couple of simultaneous timbres, probably layers or spread across the keyboard in different zones. This approach is interesting because each trig key sends the same note value. So this interface kind of deprioritizes pitch-based playing and turns each key into a distinct triggerable soundscape. Now, obviously, this isn't so different from how many drum machines or samplers work, but rather than working with short one-shot sounds or working with sounds that are the same every time they're played, I'm able to use the Digitone to create textures that change and evolve over time, which is pretty fun. So I wanted to share just a couple of details about how some of the sounds were created in this patch. Some of them use a few tricks on the Digitone that I think are pretty fun and I've been going to a lot. So the first one I want to talk about is the sound that's here on track 10. So for this sound, I'm using the FM drum machine, and I'm randomizing the tuning and the modulation rate applied to the filter's cutoff frequency. I'm using this track in unison mode, using 2 voices and applying a lot of spread here. This detunes the voices and spreads them across the stereo field. Now, where it gets really interesting is that the modulation behavior is independent for each of these 2 voices, which means that the random values for each voice are different at any given moment in time. So in this case, this creates a really cool stereo effect where the voices you hear on each side of the stereo field are similar to one another, but different, which creates the illusion of a kind of stereo panning. So now I'm going to move over to track 2. This track uses a very similar technique to make a much denser sound. So for this one, I'm modulating the FM depth and ratio with a number of random LFOs. For the sound on track 4, I'm using the Wavetone engine, and I've turned down the volume of the 2 oscillators, and I'm actually just listening to the noise source here. What I'm doing is I'm rapidly modulating the noise type and the noise character and the filter type as well, using random LFOs. So this creates a really, really dynamic and interesting texture. We could actually try applying the same unison mode trick too. Turn that on and see what that sounds like. Maybe with a bit of spread. Cool. So of course, it's super fun to play this as a multi-channel keyboard, but of course you can still sequence all of these tracks and create some really, really weird and interesting patterns. Okay, and then if that's not enough, because that's actually really cool, you can also still play the keyboard on top of the sequence. So you could get the sequence going, and then you could like mash around on the keys and add some extra gestures and sounds into the mix. So despite the fact that most people probably think of playing electron instruments primarily using the internal sequencer, at its core, The Digitone II is really a multi-timbral synthesizer with up to 16 distinct timbres available at the same time. Each one of these timbres can be addressed independently on different MIDI channels, so it's easily possible to play it with an external MIDI controller. And something else that's pretty cool is you can even play it using an external MIDI controller as the sequencer is running. So what I've really been enjoying is using a MIDI controller that can send data on multiple channels simultaneously, which gives you access to multiple timbres simultaneously. And because it has so many simultaneous timbres available, you can even divide musical responsibilities up between multiple players, which is what I'm going to be doing here. So in this patch, I have a variety of rhythmic and textural sounds programmed in here. I'm going to play some of them using the trig keys on the Digitone itself. And I'm also going to call in some help from a friend. So Ryan is going to be playing a Buchla Thunder MIDI controller, and he's going to control several other of the Digitone tracks with the Buchla Thunder. You can configure each track on the Digitone II to be either a synth or a MIDI track. If you're using multiple MIDI tracks, they could each send on a different MIDI channel, which could allow you to control multiple MIDI-capable devices simultaneously. When you create MIDI sequences, all of the same tricks of regular sequencing within the Digitone II apply. So you can apply trig conditions, trig probabilities, and so on. Now, the most obvious use case is to send MIDI note messages to other devices, but that's not all you can do. One of the interesting things is that unlike some sequencers, you can actually sequence MIDI control change messages, or CCs, basically allowing you to automate parameters on other devices. So here I have a percussive sequence set up on the Digitone that I'm sending into the Torso S4, which is a sampler and effects processor. I'm using the S4 to apply granular processing, compression, distortion, and delay to the Digitone's final output. I'm using a sequence on this MIDI track in order to send various parameter values to those processors on the S4. And additionally, I'm using the trig probability control on the Digitone so that the exact CC values that get sent aren't necessarily going to be the same each time through the sequence, which opens up a lot of room for variation. In addition to the CC sequence, I've also mapped these 4 knobs to 4 parameters on the S4 so that I can play them manually. It's also worth mentioning that you can use the LFOs from the Digitone's mod matrix to modulate the MIDI CCs, which is really cool. Okay, so let's take a listen to some examples of all of this. All right, so as you can see, the Digitone II is a super deep instrument. I personally feel like I'm just scratching the surface with it, but it's a lot of fun, and I'm really looking forward to getting deeper with it, continuing to work with it in my own music, and yeah, just getting to know it better and seeing what else I can discover. As I said at the beginning of this video, the Digitone II presented a more or less brand new workflow for me. And I found it really interesting to kind of stretch my way of working with sound and of thinking about sound design. And it was really exciting to find my way to a bunch of new timbres and new sounds that I wouldn't normally create as a result. If you would like to pick up a Digitone II for yourself, there's an affiliate link in the description below this video, and anything that you purchase using that link helps to support my channel at no extra cost to you, so I can continue making videos like this one. And finally, if you are looking for an amazing community of people who are passionate about things like sound design and synthesis and experimental music, or if you're interested in things like behind-the-scenes content and unreleased music, then I would like to invite you to check out and possibly join my Patreon community. You can learn more at patreon.com/SarahBelleReid. Special thanks to Elektron for sending me a Digitone II to try out, and also for just making really cool instruments. And thank you to all of you for watching and for listening. I'll see you next time. The Origitone within this machine, which alterators, oh my God.